morning fog rolled thick across the vineyards of Sunnyside, California, on March 15, 1990, when 22-year-old Jessica Martinez disappeared without a trace from the small agricultural town of 4,200 residents nestled in the heart of Kern County. The spring harvest season was just beginning, and Jessica had been working the early shift at Romano's packing house, sorting strawberries alongside a dozen other seasonal workers who'd known each other since high school. At 6:47 a.m., she clocked out for her morning break, telling her supervisor, Maria Santos, that she was stepping outside for fresh air and a quick phone call to her boyfriend. What happened in the next 18 minutes would haunt Sunnyside for over 3 decades. Jessica's red Toyota Corolla sat undisturbed in the employee parking lot, her purse locked inside with her keys still dangling from the ignition. Her time card showed she never returned from break, and by 8:30 a.m., Romano's management was calling the Kern County Sheriff's Department to report a missing employee. The last person to see Jessica alive was Tommy Hendricks, a forklift operator who waved to her as she walked toward the loading dock area, where workers often went to use the payphone mounted on the building's exterior wall. Jessica had vanished in broad daylight from a busy industrial facility where trucks arrived constantly and dozens of employees moved between buildings throughout their shifts. Yet somehow, between 6:47 a.m. and 7:05 a.m., she had simply disappeared from a workplace where privacy was nearly impossible, and witnesses should have been everywhere. The payphone she'd intended to use showed no record of outgoing calls during that time frame, and security cameras that might have captured her movements had been broken for weeks, awaiting repair parts that the family-owned business couldn't afford to rush order. Detective Carl Ramirez arrived at Romano's packing house just after 9 a.m., expecting to find a domestic situation or a young woman who'd decided to skip work without notice. Instead, he discovered a mystery that would define the remainder of his law enforcement career. Jessica Martinez wasn't the type to disappear without explanation. She lived with her parents in a modest house on Maple Street, attended evening classes at the community college, and maintained the kind of steady routine that made her absence immediately alarming to everyone who knew her. The initial search focused on the industrial complex surrounding Romano's packing house, where acres of processing facilities, storage warehouses, and equipment yards created countless hiding places within a relatively small area. Volunteers from the community joined sheriff's deputies in methodically examining every building, every shipping container, every piece of agricultural machinery large enough to conceal a person. The search expanded to include irrigation canals, abandoned farm structures, and the vast stretches of farmland that extended in every direction from the town's center. As hours turned to days without any trace of Jessica, the investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about life in a small agricultural community where seasonal workers, migrant laborers, and transient employees created a constantly shifting population that made it difficult to account for everyone's whereabouts. Detective Ramirez found himself interviewing people who spoke limited English, who feared contact with law enforcement, and who often worked under names that didn't match their actual identities. The informal employment practices that kept Sunnyside's agricultural economy functioning also created investigative challenges that had never been tested by a case of this magnitude. Jessica's boyfriend, Robert Chen, provided the first substantial lead when he told investigators that Jessica had seemed worried about something during the weeks before her disappearance. She'd mentioned feeling like someone was watching her, particularly during her walks home from evening classes, but she hadn't been able to identify who might be following her or why anyone would want to cause her harm. Robert had encouraged her to report her concerns to police, but Jessica had been reluctant to involve the law enforcement in what she hoped was just her imagination playing tricks on her. The investigation expanded to examine Jessica's daily routines, her classmates, her co-workers, and anyone who might have had regular contact with her during the months before her disappearance. Detective Ramirez discovered that Jessica had been an exceptional student who tutored other adult learners in basic mathematics and English composition. Her professors described her as ambitious and hardworking, someone who balanced demanding work schedules with academic responsibilities while maintaining close relationships with family and friends. Most troubling was what investigators learned about the Romano's packing house facility itself. The business employed nearly 60 people during peak season, but record-keeping was informal, security measures were minimal, and employee backgrounds were rarely verified beyond basic requirements. The loading dock area where Jessica was last seen provided access to multiple buildings and served as a transit point for delivery trucks that arrived throughout the day from locations across California and neighboring states. Detective Ramirez's examination of employment records revealed that several temporary workers had left their positions abruptly around the time of Jessica's disappearance. But tracking down these individuals proved nearly impossible. Some had provided addresses that didn't exist. Others had moved on to agricultural jobs in different counties, and a few seemed to have disappeared as completely as Jessica herself. The transient nature of agricultural work created an investigative nightmare where potential witnesses and suspects could vanish into the vast network of farms, processing plants, and seasonal employment opportunities that stretched across California's Central Valley. The community's response to Jessica's disappearance reflected the close-knit character of small-town life, where everyone knew everyone and tragedy affected entire families rather than isolated individuals. The Martinez family had lived in Sunnyside for 2 generations, and Jessica's grandparents had been among the original Mexican-American families who settled in the area during the 1940s. Her disappearance wasn't just a criminal investigation. It was a wound that cut through the heart of a community that had always prided itself on looking after its own. Local churches organized prayer vigils, businesses donated money for reward funds, and residents volunteered hundreds of hours for search efforts that continued long after official operations had been scaled back. The annual Strawberry Festival, scheduled for early May, was canceled out of respect for the Martinez family, marking the first time in the event's 15-year history that it hadn't taken place. Jessica's face appeared on flyers in every shop window. Her case was featured in regional newspapers, and her story was broadcast on television stations throughout the San Joaquin Valley. As spring turned to summer, and the initial urgency of the investigation gave way to the methodical work of following up on tips and re-examining evidence, Detective Ramirez began to understand that Jessica Martinez's case might never be solved using conventional investigative techniques. The physical evidence was limited, the witness statements were fragmentary, and the pool of potential suspects seemed to include virtually anyone who had been in Sunnyside during March 1990. Yet Ramirez couldn't let go of the conviction that someone in the community knew what had happened to Jessica, and that the truth was hidden behind a wall of silence that he hadn't yet learned how to breach. The detective's frustration deepened as months passed without significant progress. He had conducted over 100 interviews, followed up on dozens of tips, and coordinated searches of locations throughout Kern County. But Jessica Martinez remained as missing as she had been on that foggy morning when she stepped outside Romano's packing house and vanished into California's agricultural landscape. The case would consume Ramirez's career and haunt Sunnyside's collective memory. Waiting 3 decades for advances in forensic science and investigative techniques that didn't exist in 1990. The first breakthrough in Jessica Martinez's case came 18 months after her disappearance, when construction workers renovating an abandoned grain silo 12 miles outside Sunnyside discovered human remains buried beneath layers of concrete and debris. Detective Ramirez received the call on a Tuesday morning in September 1991, his pulse quickening as he drove through the early autumn haze toward what might finally be answers to the questions that had tormented him for over a year. The remains were skeletal, weathered by time and the elements, but dental records confirmed what Ramirez had hoped and feared in equal measure. Jessica Martinez had been found. The forensic examination revealed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, indicating that her death had been violent and deliberate. Yet, even with Jessica's body recovered, the investigation faced new challenges that seemed to multiply rather than resolve the mystery of what had happened on that March morning. The grain silo belonged to a property that had been abandoned since the mid-1980s, when agricultural consolidation forced many smaller operations out of business. The land had changed hands multiple times, been used for various purposes, and attracted transients, teenagers, and anyone seeking privacy for activities they preferred to keep hidden from community scrutiny. Determining who had access to the location during the relevant time frame required painstaking research through property records, employment files, and witness interviews that stretched back years before Jessica's disappearance. More troubling was the forensic evidence that suggested Jessica's body had been moved to the grain silo location sometime after her death. The positioning of the remains, the absence of certain personal effects that should have been present, and the way the burial site had been constructed indicated that wherever Jessica had been killed, it wasn't at the grain silo. Someone had transported her body there, carefully concealed it, and then managed to avoid detection for 18 months while investigators searched throughout the region. Detective Ramirez found himself investigating not just a murder, but an elaborate cover-up that required intimate knowledge of local geography, access to construction equipment, and the kind of nerve that comes from either desperation or experience with criminal activity. The killer hadn't simply disposed of Jessica's body. They had created a burial site designed to ensure she would never be found. Only the property's unexpected redevelopment had brought her remains to light. The investigation expanded to include anyone who had worked in construction, agriculture, or related industries that would provide familiarity with heavy equipment and remote locations. Ramirez compiled lists of truck drivers, equipment operators, seasonal workers, and contractors who had been in the Sunnyside area during 1990. The process was exhausting and often seemed futile, as many of the individuals he sought to interview had moved away, changed careers, or simply disappeared into the anonymous mobility that characterized much of California's agricultural workforce. Jessica's family found themselves caught between grief and determination as the investigation intensified following the discovery of her remains. Her parents, Miguel and Carmen Martinez, had spent 18 months clinging to the hope that their daughter might still be alive somewhere, possibly suffering from amnesia or being held against her will, but alive. The confirmation of her death forced them to confront a reality they had tried to avoid: the community's response to the while simultaneously providing the closure necessary to begin the long process of healing. Recovery of Jessica's body reflected the complex emotions that had defined Sunnyside since her disappearance. Relief that the uncertainty was finally over, mixed with anger that someone had taken Jessica's life and hidden her remains for so long. The funeral service drew hundreds of mourners from throughout Kern County, transforming the small Catholic church where Jessica had been baptized into a gathering place for collective grief and shared determination to see justice served. Detective Ramirez noticed subtle changes in the community's cooperation with his investigation following Jessica's funeral. People who had been reluctant to share information suddenly seemed more willing to discuss what they had observed during March 1990. Conversations that had been guarded became more open, and details that witnesses had previously dismissed as unimportant began to emerge during follow-up interviews. The detective sensed that Jessica's death had shocked the community into recognizing that their silence might be protecting someone who had committed murder. The most significant development came from an unexpected source when Maria Santos, Jessica's former supervisor at Romano's packing house, approached Detective Ramirez with information she had been hesitant to share during the initial investigation. Maria revealed that Jessica had confided her concerns about being followed to several co-workers during the weeks before her disappearance, and that these conversations had included specific details about a man who seemed to appear wherever Jessica happened to be. According to Maria's account, Jessica had described someone who drove a dark pickup truck, appeared to be in his 30s or 40s, and had the kind of weathered appearance common among men who worked outdoors in agricultural settings. Most disturbing was Jessica's observation that this individual seemed to know her schedule, appearing near the packing house during her work hours and near the community college during her evening classes. Jessica had been frightened enough to alter her routines, asking co-workers to walk with her to the parking lot and requesting schedule changes that would make her movements less predictable. Maria's revelation provided Detective Ramirez with the first concrete description of a potential suspect, but it also raised troubling questions about why this information hadn't emerged during the initial investigation. Maria admitted that she had been afraid to come forward earlier, partly because she feared retaliation if the stalker learned that Jessica had confided in her, and partly because she worried that her immigration status might complicate her involvement with law enforcement. Her decision to finally share what she knew had been prompted by the realization that Jessica's killer might target other young women if he wasn't apprehended. The detectives' renewed investigation focused on identifying owners of dark pickup trucks who had connections to both Romano's packing house and the community college where Jessica attended classes. The search parameters included employees, vendors, contractors, and anyone whose work might have brought them into regular contact with both locations. The process required cooperation from multiple agencies and businesses, many of whom were reluctant to share employee information without formal legal proceedings. As Detective Ramirez pursued this new lead, he began to understand that Jessica's case represented more than just a single crime. The investigation had revealed systematic problems with how the community protected its most vulnerable members, how businesses screened employees, and how law enforcement addressed concerns from residents who feared that their immigration status or economic circumstances might make them targets for retaliation. Jessica's death had exposed fractures in the social fabric of Sunnyside that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of her disappearance. The detective's persistence would prove crucial as the investigation entered its third year, though he couldn't have predicted that the resolution would ultimately come from advances in forensic science that were still decades away from development. For now, Ramirez continued his methodical work, driven by the conviction that someone in Sunnyside knew exactly what had happened to Jessica Martinez, and that persistence would eventually overcome the silence that had protected her killer for far too long. The case that haunted Detective Ramirez for over 2 decades would finally find resolution through DNA evidence that linked Jessica's murder to a transient agricultural worker who had died in prison years earlier, bringing closure to the Martinez family and revealing how advances in forensic science can unlock secrets that time seemed determined to keep buried forever.